Hello students, how are you all? Hopefully you are having an amazing day. I'm Naeem Amin Bhatti and today we are going to discuss the characters of the famous novel Jane Eyre was written by Charlotte Bronte. So the very first character in this particular novel is Jane Eyre. She is the protagonist of the novel. After that, Mrs. Sarah Reed, the widow of Jane's uncle Mr. Reed. Eliza Reed was the oldest daughter in the Reed family. Georgiana Reed, the youngest daughter in the Reed family, and John Reed was the only son in the Reed family, a bully Jane's cousin. Actually, this Reed family was making Jane Eyre's life uncomfortable, and she was actually knocked by their lifetime span, and she spent her lifetime span in this Reed family very uncomfortably. There was cruelty in her life, injustice by the Reed family. Basili is the servant at the Gateshead Hall. Mrs. Temple is a kind teacher and at Lowood School. Helen Burns is Jane's best friend and Lowood School, and Mr. Brockley Hurst was the headmaster at the Lowood School. Edward Fairfax Rochester is the master of Thornfield Hall, and Bertha Rochester was his wife, and she was mad and a psychological person. And if we talk about the Adele, was the ward of Mr. Edward Rochester, Jane's pupil at the Thornfield, and Mrs. Alice Fairfax was the housekeeper at the Thornfield Hall, and St. John Eyre Rivers was the minister of the parish at Morton, and Diana and Mary Rivers were the sisters of John Rivers. So basically, the Rivers family was the relative to Jane Eyre, and they also gave Jane Eyre the amount of £20,000 as their family share. Now, having some of the informations in an elaborative way, we talk about the Edward Rochester, that Jane's employer and the master of the Thornfield, is a wealthy, passionate man with a dark secret that gives the reader much of the novel's suspense. He is unconventional, ready to go against the polite manners, property, and if we talk about the consideration of the social class in order to interact with the Jane frankly and directly. He is rude, impetuous, and has spent much of his life roaming about the Europe, trying to avoid the consequences of his youthful past. His problems are partly to result of his own recklessness, but he is a sympathetic figure and has been describing and suffering of the character because of his early marriage to the Bertha. We talk about Jane Eyre. She is the protagonist and narrator of this novel, and Jane is intelligent, honest, plain featured young girl that has been faced oppression, inequality, and hardship in her early life. Although she meets a series of the people who threaten her actually autonomy, Jane repeatedly succeeds in preserving herself and maintains her principles of the justice, human dignity, and morality in her. She also values the intellectual and emotional fulfillment. Her strong belief in the social eloquency and equality, and challenging the Victorian prejudices at that time against the women and the poor people. She was describing the women at that time who was actually in a fit of fury and actually having no particular type of the rights in their society. So Bertha is basically the complex persons, and actually she obstacles the Jane's happiness, but she also increases the growth of the Jane's self-understanding. She is a psychological patient. She is the character which was actually also locked away in her room, and develops the gothic elements in the plot of this novel. Bertha was in fact from Jamaica, and she also could be seen as the typical Victorian wife who is expected never to travel or work outside the house. She is definitely linked to the figure of the social inequality of the women at the 19th century. St. John Rivers was actually living with his sisters Mary and Diana, and he is described as the Jane's benefactor after she runs away from Thornfield, giving the food and shelter. She was mannered, man, fair, blue-eyed, with the Grecian profile, but cold and reserved, often controlled in his interactions with the others, because he is entirely alienated from the feelings and devoted solely to the his own ambition, that he always used to roaming all around the world, and he could be seen as a foil of Edward Rochester. So let's talk about the summary of this particular novel, Jane Eyre. So 10 years old orphan Jane Eyre lives unhappily with her wealthy, cruel cousins and aunt at Gateshead. Her only salvation from her daily humiliations, and such as being locked up in a red room where she thinks that she sees her beloved uncle's ghost. So this is one kind of gothic element in our plot. It is the kindly servant Bessie, and Jane spread the further mistreatment from the Reed family, and she was living here in a cruelty, and they always have a cruel face on her. And she befriends with Helen Burns in her school, and who applauds and upholds the doctrine of the Christian forgiveness and tolerance, and it's taken to under the wings of the superintendent Miss Temple. An outbreak of the typhus alerts benefactors and the school. The terrible conditions of Mr. Brocklehurst is replaced, and Jane excels as the students for 6 years and as a teacher for 2. So actually she spends 8 years here in Lowood School, where she was sent. We talk about Jane's employment after that 18 years. She was be a governess at the estate of the Thornfield for the little girl Adele, and after much of the waiting, Jane finally meets her employer Edward Rochester, and there was a love at first sight. And other oddities around the Thornfield includes the occasional dominance or the demonic laugh Jane hears the emanating from the third story attic. Rochester always attributes it to the great spool, the seamstress who works up there, but Jane is never fully convinced, and their fires she has to put out one night in Rochester's bedroom plants further doubts. We talk about the Jane development like attraction to Rochester, not based on the looks, both are considered plain, but on their intellectual communication. However, higher social standings of the beautiful Miss Ingram seemingly to violate her above Jane, though Rochester flirts with the idea of the marrying Miss Ingram, but in the aware of that the functional ambitions for marriage. An old acquaintance of the Rochesters, Richard Mason, visits the Thornfield and is severely injured from the attack, and apparently from the grace of the middle and the night in the attic. Jane, baffled by the circumstances, turns to him, and Rochester confesses to her that he made an error in the past that he hoped to overturn by marrying Miss Ingram. He says that he has another governess position for Jane lined up in elsewhere. So actually he was trying to pursue Jane to marry with her. And Jane returns to Gateshead for a while to see that dying and Mrs. Reed's, and when she returns to Thornfield, Rochester says that he knows that Miss Ingram is after him only for his money and asks Jane to marry him. So he pursues and proposes Jane, and Jane accepts, but a month later Mason and solicitor Mr. Briggs came there and interrupted the ceremony of that marriage and said that he has a wife, Bertha Mason. Basically, he is the Mason's sister, and a person who was the psychological patient person. Despite his protest that he loves Jane, she cannot agree to marry him because of his previous marriage and leaves the Thornfield. So Jane arrives at the desolate crossroads of White Cross and reduced the begging for food. Fortunately, the River siblings, St. John, Diana, and Mary, they were three persons from the River family, take her into her home and into their home and moor house. She develops a great affection for the ladies, while especially the religious St. John's is harder to get close to that happily teaches at St. John's School. Jane learns that she has inherited the vast fortune from the uncle and that the river siblings are their cousins, and she divides it among her new family and phases out her teaching duties. After that, Miss St. John Rivers proposes to Jane, but Jane was not agree with the St. John River, and she goes back towards the Thornfield, and she discovers that the estate has been burned down by Bertha, who was a patient, a psychological patient, and who died in the fire, and that Rochester, who was blinded in the incident, lives nearby. He is overjoyed when she locates him and relates the sides of the mystical connections Jane had, and the Jane marry and then enjoy the life together with Mr. Rochester, and he regains his sight of the one eye. Diana and Mary both of these person marry, while Saint John continues his unmarried life and a journey towards India, and he is actually going to India and to make some of his life to enjoyable and to spend a time there. So the summary ends here, and in our next lecture we will discuss the themes of Jane Eyre. So till the next lecture, it's goodbye from me.